This is the Read, Write, and Create podcast, the podcast where you get a bite-sized session of creative writing coaching from me, Lori L. Tharps. I'm a storytelling evangelist who moved to the south of Spain so I could live a global literary life. I'm also an award-winning author of both fiction and nonfiction, a journalist, and a former college professor. I created this podcast because I want to help as many BIPOC writers as possible get their stories out of their heads and into the world. Are you ready? Let's go. On today's show, I'm going to be giving you a pep talk that explains how perseverance, persistence, and pain can lead to productivity, fame, and fortune in a writer's life. And I'll be using the very true story of African-American crime writer Chester B. Himes as my source material. In case you didn't know, Chester Himes is considered one of the most important crime writers in history. Known for his hard-boiled detective novels based in Harlem in the 1950s and 60s. Chester Himes was a prolific writer who, in addition to novels, wrote social criticism, short stories, and memoir. But he is most well known for those detective novels, including Cotton Comes to Harlem and Blind Man with a Pistol. Chester Himes was friends with Langston Hughes, hung out in Paris with James Baldwin, and like me, chose to live the final years of his life on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea in Spain. In this episode, you're going to learn how Himes turned the unfortunate events in his life, including a troubled childhood, virulent and violent racism, and prison time, into an award-winning, prolific, and legendary literary career. And remember, as always, I'm sharing these stories because I want you to remember, if our literary ancestors could turn their pain into art, you can too. Hello, wordsmiths, storytellers, and scribes. If you're new here, thank you for pressing play. And I hope that what you hear today leaves you inspired and ready to write. If you're one of my returning listeners, welcome back. And I hope the same thing for you, because I want everybody listening to always feel inspired. And I want you to feel more motivated to write and to feel like you should be taking your writing seriously after you listen to these episodes. As for me, what's going on? Well, as I mentioned in my last episode, I recently finished a draft of my next novel and sent it out to beta readers. So while I'm waiting for those edits and suggestions, I'm concentrating on some of my nonfiction work, my blog posts and articles right now. And I'm always jotting down ideas for, my next novel. I took a writing workshop once with the amazing Elizabeth Nunez, and she told us that when we finished writing a manuscript, we should spend one day celebrating and then get busy writing the next book. And hey, that is the real formula for having a prolific and productive writing career. One day celebrating and then get back to work, which is actually a great way to segue into today's episode all about Chester Himes, because Chester Himes was truly a prolific writer who, even when faced with debilitating illnesses, imprisonment, and degrading racism, he was publishing articles, essays, short stories, and 20 books. 20 books of both fiction and nonfiction. So let's get into his story. Once upon a time, there was a young boy named Chester Bomar Himes. Chester was born on July 29th, 1909 in Jefferson City, Missouri. He had an older brother, and both of his parents were educators. His father taught industrial trades at historically Black colleges, and his mother had been a teacher before she got married, but when she had children, she quit teaching so she could stay at home with them. In most biographies about Himes, his household was described as decidedly middle class. However, the family did have to move around a lot based on wherever Chester's father got teaching jobs. So from the outside looking in, Himes' childhood looked like he had all the benefits of being born into a stable, somewhat privileged middle-class family. Educated parents, stay-at-home mom. However, Himes' childhood was actually marked by tragedy and trauma. There were three key incidents that were particularly influential in shaping Chester's worldview for the rest of his life. First of all, his parents' relationship was truly a volatile one. Apparently, they were always fighting, and they actually ended up divorcing when Chester was a teen. Second pivotal moment in Chester's young life was watching his brother get refused treatment at a local hospital after a horrible accident left him temporarily blinded. The whole family was there, standing outside the hospital, his father crying and pleading for the hospital to admit his son for help, but they refused to let him even in the doors because they were Black. Chester's brother remained permanently blind because of that racist refusal, and that marked Chester for life. And third, Chester fell down an elevator shaft when he was working as a bellhop at a hotel when he was a teenager. The fall did extensive damage to his back and his spine. Chester spent months in a full body cast and had to relearn how to walk. That's how bad it was. And even after the bones were reset and his bruises were gone, Chester continued to suffer from chronic pain after that fall. Now, despite all of this, what one might consider too much trauma to make anybody have the desire to do anything positive with their life, Chester made it to college. He enrolled as a freshman at Ohio State University, but unfortunately, he was expelled in his first year because of a prank that, again, in most of my research, it's just listed as a prank. I read somewhere that it was involving pimps and prostitutes. I don't know what this prank was, but regardless, it got him expelled. And by that time, Chester was really dealing with his anger. He was full of piss and vinegar, just angry at everything that had happened to him and his family. And he was drinking a lot to dull the physical pain he was in because of that accident and the psychic pain that came from just being a Black child in early 20th century America. Once he got kicked out of school, Chester went back home, tried to find a job, but really what he found was a place in criminal activities in Ohio. So he got into robbing people. He got into working in illegal gambling dens and other not so legal activities. He was being arrested here and there, but he got caught eventually for a very serious armed robbery, and he was sentenced to 20 to 25 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary. So he's facing 20 to 25 years in prison as a very young man. Interestingly, prison marked the end of Chester's criminal life, but it marked the beginning of his writing life. So really, Chester makes it to this awful prison. I mean, this is a prison full of the worst criminals of the area. And he decided, like, he made the decision that he was either going to die in prison or he was going to write in prison. And he chose writing. He spent most of his time voraciously reading, trying to learn the craft. He had read about other writers who started writing in prison and decided that he was going to do the same for himself. And ironically, it was because of that elevator shaft incident, because he was in pain and I guess considered disabled to a certain extent, he was excused from doing some of the heavy prison labor and was left alone in his cell where he spent all of his time reading and writing. Fun fact, Chester decided that since he was going to learn to be a writer in prison, he ordered himself a Remington typewriter to be delivered to his cell. I just think it's kind of funny because today prisoners can't even order hardcover books because they're considered potential weapons, but Chester Himes could order a Remington typewriter. And if you know what a Remington typewriter looks like and how heavy it is and how many sharp points there are on it, I think it's amazing that apparently prison officials saw writing as redemptive and were like, here you go, Chester, here's that typewriter you ordered. And spoiler alert, that typewriter was redemptive. Soon, Chester's articles and stories that he was writing were printed in local newspapers and then national newspapers and then magazines, including Esquire magazine. And it was the publication in Esquire that really started to get his name known. So while he was in prison, a fire broke out, and Chester wrote about that fire, which killed over 300 men. And it actually still stands as the deadliest prison fire in American history. Now, Chester was able to provide a searing and emotional firsthand account of what it was like to be in that fire, watching prisoners, apparently the guards wouldn't let them out of their cells. He watched this horror unfold. I mean, again, talk about trauma. But what he did was he turned it into a really incredible article that was published. And so put a pin in that moment because this was a perfect example, again, of Chester realizing that he could channel his pain into his art, into his writing. And sure enough, after serving almost 8 years of his 25-year sentence, Chester was released from prison, and prison officials cited his writing as proof that he had redeemed himself, which, side note, just one more incredible example of the power of storytelling and writing. So once he gets out of prison, Chester Himes becomes a full-time professional writer, and his life was perfect. Not, yeah, that would have been a short episode. Actually, as a reminder, Chester was released in 1936, just as the United States is coming out of the Great Depression. So, like just about everybody else, Chester was forced to work odd jobs just to make ends meet. But that didn't stop him from doing what? If you guessed writing, you're right. So even as he's working just menial jobs here and there, he's continuously writing, continuously working on his craft, writing and reading. And in this time, in post-Depression America, because he keeps writing, because he keeps getting his work published, he is embraced and befriended by many in the Black literati, including one young man by the name of Langston Hughes. Yes, it was his friendship with Langston Hughes and others that allowed him to start being recognized and making a larger name for himself in the writing world. And his first novel was published, actually. So, he's writing short stories and essays. And then he really hunkered down, started his first novel. It was called If He Hollers, Let Him Go. And that was released in 1945. And once that novel was published by a major publisher, mind you, that's all it took for Chester to take himself 100% seriously and say, I am going to be a writer. This is what I'm dedicating my life to. After that first novel came out, his second novel, only 2 years later, in 1947, called Lonely Crusade. And in 1948, Chester was awarded a residency at the prestigious Yaddo Retreat. So you can see that Chester is on a roll. He is really making a name for himself. Both of those novels were loosely based on his own experiences facing racism in America. Complete social criticism, social commentary woven into the stories, very well received, but they were not bestsellers. They did not make Chester Himes rich. He still needed to find a job. He still needed to write being super productive just to keep the lights on. However, like he did in prison, Chester just kept working, kept trying different things. And he eventually, through connections, got a job in Hollywood working at Warner Brothers Studio as a script writer. Now, this felt like such a stroke of luck. Here he is writing professionally, working in Hollywood. This is a steady job. This is financial stability, doing what he loved until one of the Warner brothers, Jack Warner, discovered that this Chester Bomar Himes was a Negro. And under no terms will a Negro work at his studio. And he fired him on the spot, using another word for Negro that rhymes with the name of Winnie the Pooh's striped little friend Tigger. You know what I'm saying. He unceremoniously fires him, saying he is not going to have any of those types of people working for him. And Chester's out of a job. And he's embarrassed and he's furious. This was the last straw for Chester Himes in this battle with America's racism. And he wrote in his autobiography about this moment, quote, "Up to the age of 31, I had been hurt emotionally, spiritually, and physically as much as 31 years can bear. I had lived in the South. I had fallen down an elevator shaft. I had been kicked out of college. I had served 7.5 years in prison. I had survived the humiliating last 5 years of the Depression in Cleveland. And still, I was entire, complete, functional. My mind was sharp. My reflexes were good. And I was not bitter. But under the mental corrosion of race prejudice in Los Angeles, I became bitter and saturated with hate." So in 1953, Chester left the United States, heading to Europe to see if life was any better for a Black man on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. To make a long story a little shorter, it was. After a year of traveling around Europe, Chester decides to make a life in Paris, finding community with the likes of James Baldwin and Richard Wright, who showed him a better version of a writing life without American racism getting in the way. It wasn't perfect, obviously, but it gave Chester breathing room to create and do right. So here he is in Paris, free from America's racism, having a literary community to come home to, but he still had to make money. He still had to support himself. And those jobs weren't coming super easy. So when a French publisher approached him, asking him to write a crime novel set in Harlem, hey, you're a good writer. Could you do this? Chester was like, no. Yeah, he was like, no, I don't write crime novels. That's not my thing. I do social commentary. I do this type of novel. But this publisher kept insisting, saying, you can do it. Why don't you try it? Chester contemplated the 40 cents that he had in his bank account and was like, you know what? Let me give it a try. I got nothing to lose. That book turned out to be For the Love of Imabel. And not only did he finish it, not only was the publisher happy, it won the prestigious Grand Prix Award in France for the best detective novel of the year in 1957. Good job, Chester. Way to give it a try. Now, that book led to his famous Harlem series. 9 books came out of that series, and that series cemented Chester's career. Some of the other titles in that series may sound familiar. Cotton Comes to Harlem, A Rage in Harlem. Yep, that was the basis for that 1991 film for my fellow Gen Xers. And Real Cool Killers. Those are just some of the titles, again, that you might have heard. That's where it all started, with those crime detective novels. Today, many Black crime writers pay homage to Chester Himes for kind of starting this genre of Harlem-based Black detectives. And this was, again, what put his name on the map on a global scale. So in 1966, 6 of Chester's detective novels in this series were optioned for film. Yeah, 6 of them, at which point he was paid a significant amount of money. Now, Himes always said that it was at this point that he felt like he officially made it and that he could get off the hamster wheel of nonstop production to pay his bills. He was finally financially stable. So at that point, does he stop writing? No. He just stopped writing like a crazy person and was able to invest in his own happiness in a way. And what he did was he moved to Spain in 1969, where he could buy land and build a house, a beautiful house, mind you, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, that he named Casa de Grillo, House of the Storyteller. But actually, Grillo was the name of his cat. And if you know anything about Chester Himes, he loved that cat. So anyway, it was called House of the Storyteller, but really it was like, this is my cat's house. So he moves to Spain. He gets remarried. He becomes a member of the local community of Teulada, Spain. That was the little tiny town. And again, it was a pretty small fishing town at that point. He wrote 2 memoirs, The Quality of Hurt, which came out in 1972. And then he wrote a part 2, which was My Life of Absurdity, which came out in 1976. In fact, even after he had a stroke, even after he was diagnosed with Parkinson's, even after he was relegated to a wheelchair, he keeps writing. Chester keeps writing. I mean, his health is severely deteriorating, but because he still had more to say, and because writing had saved him from a life of crime, his writing also saved him when his body started to fail him. His last book, A Case of Rape, was published in 1985, the year after he died, because he was literally writing until the end and still had unpublished work. Chester Himes died in Moraida, Spain in 1984 from Parkinson's disease. Sadly, when he died, he was more known and admired in Paris and Spain than in the United States, although that is changing now. There has been a marked resurgence of respect and acknowledgement of Chester Himes' contributions to American crime fiction. His name is now often mentioned in the same sentences with the likes of Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, and even Edgar Allan Poe. This year, 2024, Himes will be receiving the Yados Artist Medal in November, where he is being described not only as a great crime writer, but rather, quote, a great American novelist whose influence continues to impact young writers, unquote. So, what are the literary lessons we can take from the life of Chester Bomar Himes? Lessons that we can apply to our own literary lives. First, use your pain to make art. At the lowest point in his life, sentenced to 25 years in prison, witness to the worst prison fire in U.S. history, the victim of violent racism, Himes turned to his typewriter to pour out his pain, to make sense of it, to throw it back onto America to deal with rather than hide from it, or rather than take it all on by himself and let it eat him up inside. Some people resented Chester Himes for the rawness and realness of his prose, but many more appreciated him for his honesty. So be like Chester and turn your pain into your greatest stories, fiction or nonfiction. Use it. Number 2, adapt and accept opportunities as they come. When French publisher Marcel Duhamel approached Himes in Paris to write a detective novel, remember, he said no at first, but then it was like, I got nothing to lose, everything to gain, which he did by just trying. He got international fame, a significant fortune, and a lasting literary legacy. So be like Chester and take the writing opportunities that come your way, even if they're not what you were expecting or what you think you should be doing. Try your best and see what happens. You've got nothing to lose and so much to gain. Number 3, do whatever you can to get away from racism. Chester Himes understood from a very early age that America's racism was a killer of dreams and, much more practically, a killer of men. So what did he do? He left America as soon as he could. He left because racism was an enemy that he could not fight, but it was destroying him. And it was threatening to destroy his creativity and his desire to write. First, he went to Paris. And then, and this isn't often talked about, but he left Paris because of the growing racist sentiments against Algerians at the time. He said he couldn't abide by it, and that's why he moved to Spain. Chester prioritized his mental health, his sanity and safety, his comfort and peace of mind so he could write. Was Spain perfect and racism-free? Of course not. But for Chester, it was better than what he was dealing with at the time in France and at the time in the United States. So be like Chester and prioritize your mental health and your sense of safety as a writer. Put yourself in spaces where you can write without the oppressive stench of racism getting in the way. Do you have to move to France or Spain to do that? No, but maybe you do need to take yourself on writing retreats once in a while, for example. Or maybe you need to leave the city and go out to the country where you can be in peace to write. Or maybe it's just finding a community of fellow writers of color who provide that safe space for your writing. And number 4, write what you know and then extrapolate. Chester Himes began his writing career in prison. That's where he was. That's where he was looking at being for the next 20 years. So what did he write about? Prison life. He wrote essays, articles, even short stories about life in prison. Then when he got out and was working on his first novel, that first novel was about a Black man facing racism in Los Angeles. You see where I'm going here? Chester Himes didn't spend time wondering, oh my God, what should I write about? Or, prison life isn't trending right now. I don't think anyone's going to want to read my stuff. He took what he had, the stories that were all around him, and used that as his source material. He wrote about his world, his thoughts, his experiences, his people, and he never apologized for it. He put that out into the world because that's what he had. So be like Chester. Use your own life and the world around you for rich and juicy source material, and then build on that. Suffice to say, you don't have to go out and live a life of crime to have good things to write about. Not what we're saying. Truly, there are amazing stories all around you. Just look around. All right, there's your pep talk. Remember, if Chester Himes could become a financially stable, international best-selling, award-winning author, mind you, international best-selling author, his work was translated into multiple languages, who wrote about Black people when Black people were still second-class citizens, like legally, after surviving a life-threatening accident, crippling racism, 8 years in prison, and poor health, then what's your excuse, my friend? What is it that you can't do? If Chester Himes could overcome all of those barriers, what are you waiting for? You can do it too. Chester Himes lived an incredible life, and I've only touched on bits of it here. I haven't included all of the parts that are more complicated and uncomfortable and show more of the ugly sides of Himes's character. And when I say ugly, I mean we all have ugly bits and pieces of ourselves. But for example, something that comes up for a lot of people is his treatment of women, both in real life and on the page. To some, it's quite disturbing and offensive. Currently, I'm reading some of his work right now, and his treatment of women on the page is offensive. But a writer isn't a hero. A writer is human. We don't have to put our literary ancestors on pedestals to learn from their life experiences and benefit from their wisdom as writers. So, in addition to Chester Himes' own memoirs, Lawrence P. Jackson wrote an award-winning biography of Chester Himes called Chester B. Himes. Great title, right? And in that book, Jackson does a really good job exploring the true man, all facets of him. So a great biography, highly recommend it if you really want to get a full scope of who Chester B. Himes was. Of course, I'll leave links in the show notes. Also, if you'd like to see some videos and images from where Chester Himes spent his final years in Spain, you can check out my new YouTube channel at Literary Lori, because I have a video there showing my recent literary pilgrimage to Moreira, Spain, where Chester Himes spent his final years. If you're looking for more inspiration and information to optimize your writing life, visit the Read, Write, and Create website. That's at readwriteandcreate.com. Remember, that's REED, writeandcreate.com. And don't forget, applications are only being accepted for 4 more days to join the Read, Write, and Create Sanctuary, our private membership community for BIPOC women writers who take their writing seriously. The last day to apply before doors close for the season is September 27th, 2024. In case you haven't heard of the Sanctuary, it's our community for emerging writers and seasoned authors who want to get paid and get published. Our resources, workshops, classes, and community are made to support writers through the entire life cycle of their writing life. So from writing to getting published to promoting your work, we are there every step of the way. Now, if you're one of these writers who's tired of doing great work, writing all the time, but not seeing the results that you want, not getting published in the publications that you want to get published in, or finding that book deal that you've been waiting for, if you're ready to optimize your writing life and see your words in the world making real impact, then visit the Read, Write, and Create website and click on the Sanctuary page. Instructions on how to apply are there. Of course, the link is in the show notes. The Read, Write, and Create podcast is produced by me, Lori L. Tharps. Our editor is Brad Linder, and our theme music is by Wataboy. Until next time, listeners, keep writing. The world needs more BIPOC stories by BIPOC storytellers just like you.